morning. It's so great to see so many familiar faces from 4 years ago and from 4 years before that. We have been talking about working together as a community for a long time, and we have some great examples of what it takes to build coalitions to advance policies and initiatives that makes a safer nation, a safer community. And so today we're going to hear from two experts who are working with coalitions and providing tools and resources and practical application of coalitions. But I want to give a sense of what it takes to make a coalition happen. And I'm going to give a couple tips to that point. But before we get started, I'm going to ask you to do something. And I think you can do it. But some people are on their phones, and some people have their phone in their purse or their pocket. But most people, look, Keith doesn't have his phone out at all. That's good. I might ask you to take it out in a minute. But show me, raise your hand. Raise your hand. That's all I'm going to ask you to do. Raise your hand right now if you are not from the government. Great, great. Okay, this is like 20 questions, but it's only 10. How many of you are nonprofit? Okay, maybe 25% or so. How many engineers, structural or otherwise, do we have in the room? Where are my engineers at? Love the engineers. Good job. Thank you for being here. How many elected officials are here? How many of you are elected? Okay. How many of you are from local government? So you're not state, federal, but local government. We've got 8. Welcome. How many of you, not a homeowner, but a building owner? You're a building owner or a manager from a major building or a minor building, but not a home, not your own home. Any building owners? Okay. Any apartment owners? Anyone in the faith-based community? Anybody, any religious organization here? All right. Any school representative? I saw Jill Barnes, so I know that one school at least, but how many school folks? Education, we've got a couple over here as well. Okay, 3. When you talk about coalitions, we have the start of a coalition here because we have people from, emergency management. Anybody emergency management? That's what I thought. So we have emergency management. You got to have emergency management to start. And then you start to go along with the other people. So when we talk about coalitions, it's not just the people that are in this room. It's really the people that are not in this room that we want to talk to. So another question here to get us going. Think about for a minute, what's the reason you do your job? And if it's for a paycheck, and there's doors right there, why is it you do your job? Why are we in this room today around earthquake issues specifically? Many of you traveled very far. Some of us traveled very far on one freeway for like 20 miles for like 2 hours. But think about for a moment why you're here. And then by you don't have to show of hands, but think about how many of you have kids. You know, I'm a recent new dad for the first time, very exciting. And I have a 6-month-old at home who made me late here this morning. But the work I do is because there's someone I know now for the first time in my life really counting on me. But some of you have been doing this work for decades and are great at the work you do. And so there's a reason you got into this work. And what drives you every day, that drives you to leave your family to be here today, whether it's across the country or just across the freeway, to be here, that reason that drives you is what makes you here today. So when you're forming a coalition, there's a driver that is the fundamental driver for everybody you want as part of your coalition to move your agenda forward. So you have to think about why you're here and why other people are here. Now, there's a couple people probably in this room that, you're here to make a connection, maybe get a new client, maybe learn a new practice. But I bet 99% of us are here because we believe we can make a difference and change the way the nation and our local communities reacts when the disaster strikes. And that's the fundamental of building a coalition, tapping into the emotional connection that you have to the issue at hand. So that's the framework by which we're talking about coalitions today. But I'm the big speaker in terms of no PowerPoint, but we do have 2 excellent presentations that we'll start with by way of introduction. I've asked each of our panelists to present for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion of the 3 of us, and then we'll open it up to questions so that we can address the concerns that are raised and questions that you have burning in your heart about how it is you can get someone that has no interest in earthquakes interested in earthquakes. So with that, I'm going to turn to my right first. It's my left, actually. To to Charlie, I'm going to say your name. Hike, Charlie Hike. Charlie may have had the shortest commute of anyone not staying in the hotel, right?
I believe so.
Where's your office, Charlie?
Right across the street.
Right across the street. So there's a reason he's here. He's the executive vice president of ImageCat, and through his role at ImageCat, he's working to provide visualizations and tools to communities as they work to get the best information in order to inform their coalition work. So with that, I'm going to not take his presentation and let him go forward, and either at the podium or wherever you're comfortable. Okay, perfect. So round of applause for Charlie, everybody.
Thank you, John. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm right across the street, so if you're interested in anything we have to say, either grab me after the presentation and we can go through some things, or if you want to meet some of the engineers or people involved, I can take you across the street. So my presentation is called Enabling the Spiral of Optimism and Action Through Risk Awareness and Harnessing Communities as Sensors, which my daughter told me is way too long and way too silly, but hopefully by the time I'm done here, you'll have an idea of what I mean by that. So I start from the premise that I can use this, and that's incorrect. It's the big green one. Oh, well, there we go. Okay, so that risk is poorly understood by those that are at risk. So here we go. I think that we're all pretty familiar with Hurricane Katrina. The people that were living there in New Orleans, I don't think had really any idea of the real risk that they were facing. But there's another example from Bangkok in Thailand, where there was industrial facilities all throughout the river, and these were extremely critical facilities for the production of flash drives, which had become extremely important. But even though they were right there in the river in Southeast Asia, where it floods all the time, this risk was not understood by the insurers. It took them months to figure out, okay, what's really going to be the cascading effects from this event. So risk is really poorly understood by the people that bear the risk. So what can we do about that? Where do I point this? There we go. I think there's two things that we can do. We can tell people what we know, and we can listen to what they have to say. So really radical stuff. Develop tools to effectively communicate risk online and harness communities as sensors. First, develop tools to effectively communicate risk online. Put your simulation tools online. Make them available. Let people play with the assumptions. Let people see the uncertainty. Let people pull up their house, see what's going to happen. Use the best data that you have available for them to see what the impacts are likely to be. Make them easy to use, make them fast, and make them fun. Very easy to do now. However, right now we have HAZUS, FEMA's loss estimation earthquake tool, and I think we all recognize that this was put together in a completely different paradigm. Unfair to compare it to modern things like you see across the street with wind concern and so forth. But nevertheless, at this point, it requires thousands of dollars worth of software. It's difficult to install. And I think most importantly, the best data that's collected for HAZUS is not available for communities to use. It's for official use only, which means that foreign nationals can't use it, consultants can't necessarily use it, and that means that the data can't be shared and the results can't be shared widely throughout the communities. And the other problem is that it's not backwardly compatible. So Hope Seligson, for example, does a very good job with a shakeout scenario, develops very detailed exposure databases, which is used to produce very detailed results. Then that means in a couple years later, they're unable to reuse those databases to update the results. So we've got a kind of a seed of an alternative here that we're offering through the Community Stakeholder Network. This is a private-public partnership by the Homeland Security Advisory Council. They have a portal that just produces basic disaster information that is available to, say, Westfield Malls or Walmart or Sony or LA City for everyone to get on the same page. And as part of that, we have a tool called Inlet that we provide. It provides earthquake loss estimation for California. It's similar to HAZUS, uses a lot of the same damage functions and returns results in seconds, not hours. And I dare say it's fun to use, people say. So that's good. So I'm just going to show a couple screens from it. You can pull up shakeout scenarios, just select them, and it brings up the results instantly. So you have those kind of at your fingertips in a way that you can drill down to your community and see those all throughout the state. Or you can just drop epicenters around your city, Long Beach, for example, just 6.0, 6.2, 6.4, and it will snap those epicenters to the nearest fault, calculate the fault rupture, calculate the ground motion throughout the area, and give you a first impression of what the damage is likely to be. So I don't expect you to read this, but on the side here we have the number of damaged buildings, and you can drop that down and show that for your faith-based community, for your education, for your banking and so forth. All of the people that have actually put money into the CSN system. In addition, you can bring up your injuries and casualties and drill down and map those throughout your area. So, for example, for each of those scenarios that you drop on Long Beach, just to prepare yourself mentally for what might happen, you can map the life-threatening casualties along with your hospitals and your fire stations so that you can kind of get a mental grip of what might happen. And of course, after an event, we have the ShakeCast system that just pushes the shake maps to the system. And in the Chino Hills event and the Napa event, we were able to just communicate what happened right away, let people know what kind of level of damage to expect. So this is just one of many tools that are out there, good ones. You saw the Tembler application probably, one concern. We're thinking of developing some similar tools for Jumpstart to help communicate insurance risk to Californians to decide whether or not they want to purchase insurance. But why is this important? It's important because people still think that California is going to break off and fall into the ocean. Just yesterday, the doorman at our building, when he heard there was an earthquake conference here and heard everything that was said, he said, "So are we going to become an island?" It's like, "No, dude, don't worry about it. We're not going to be an island." The problem is this level of hyperbolic disaster scenario really inspires apathy and inaction, because if you think that it's just going to be completely death and destruction, and that's going to happen, then there's not much that you can do for mitigation. So that's my first premise. Tell people what you know. My second premise is listen to what they have to say. This is not rocket science. Everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody can take pictures. They're geo-referenced. Everybody can upload those to the cloud. This idea that we're going to use 911 call centers in a major disaster to make decisions, it's just not scalable. You can collect these images, you can have them crowdsourced, you can interpret them in that type of environment, and government really must figure out how to harness this information in the 21st century. Fortunately, the biggest social network, Facebook, is not well suited for that. Everybody minimizes their digital profile. They don't want their neighbors to see them at the parties or whatever. And there's no organized attempt by Facebook to have the images that might be useful for damage response that I know available for emergency responders. And they do not have geo-referenced photos as far as I know. A stellar example, I don't have to go into this very much. Everybody's probably familiar with the Did You Feel It system. Tens of thousands of people filling out very long forms telling the USGS how much ground shaking there was for them to refine their shake maps. Just absolutely incredible that people are doing this and that they're used to inform response. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that we did after Hurricane Sandy. I think that is a good kind of template for how we might be able to listen to what people have to say digitally, so to speak. So these are images of flooding that we gleaned from the New York Times or from Twitter or Instagram. I'm not quite sure which. They didn't always have georeferencing in them, but we were able to use the actual landmarks and the images to locate them. We combined this with satellite data, aerial photography, to actually crowdsource interpretation of damage on a building-by-building basis all throughout the area. So we had almost 150,000 estimates in 2 weeks under contract by one of the FEMA consultants. So this, as far as I understand, I've asked several times, was used to expedite rental assistance after Hurricane Sandy. So in addition, this data was served out to the community through ArcGIS Online. New York Times picked this up and reserved it back out to the communities. and to individuals, so many of them who had probably fled the area, so they can have an understanding of what happened in their area. So finally, what is this spiral of optimism and action that I made up? It's the opposite of the spiral of cynicism and apathy. Essentially, that's a theory that, you know, the media insults politicians to the communities. The decision makers and the politicians insult the media to the communities. The communities say, well, what are we going to do? They don't feel like they have any chance of affecting political action or media, and they just sort of crawl down. I've added an additional block that wasn't in the book that I know of. Analysts there in the corner providing oblique reports to decision makers that are probably not followed because they don't really in any way communicate directly with the communities. So compare this to what happened in Superstorm Sandy. You had communities providing georeferenced images to the media pumping those back out to analysts, where we're using that to come up with a rapid distribution of damage, which was given back to the media, which was given back to the communities, and the media gave it back to other communities who didn't necessarily know about ArcGIS Online through the New York Times. So you've got information flowing all over the place. The conversation has started, and because of that, you have the needs of the communities well known by the decision makers, and that's used to justify rapid assistance to those communities. Positive feedback loop. So let's step back and look at the CSN example, which is more of a mitigation. In this case, our analytical group provided the engine to the CSN system, which pumps out realistic disaster scenarios to communities so they can understand what they might face, and they're able to communicate that to the decision makers and use that to prioritize funding. In addition, after an event, they're able to provide observations through the Did You Feel It system, which is used to basically refine those estimates. I'll go ahead and skip the negative example. We'll keep it positive here. Dave Wald showed this a couple days ago, this article that you're probably all familiar with from the New Yorker, and he had some criticism of it, and I'm sure that everything he said was correct. Nonetheless, I think this was a really amazing article, and you know, all of my friends in the Pacific Northwest who are not in our industry really started talking about what might happen, what they could do, how they might affect political change, what realistically could happen. And almost to apologize for the boringness of this article, the New Yorker sticks in this cartoon. I'm sure you can't read the caption. The guy talking is putting the investigators and the police officer to sleep, and he says, "Perhaps I've said too much." So, you know, even though the media might think of this as a dull topic, we beg of you, please stay with it, because the alternative is this kind of hyperbolic vision that really inspires nothing but apathy. Okay.
Thank you, Charlie. I know you've got some questions, so hold those. We're going to go to David just in a moment. But we've had some people come in and out of the room just to make sure. Any elected officials show up yet? Any elected officials? Okay. I didn't ask earlier. Any media in the room? Any media in the room? I see one over here. I guess. And Ron left, huh? We were going to pick on the LA Times. We'll do that later because of your point about the media. So next we have presenting David Eisenman. David is working in Southern California as well. He is at UCLA. I'm not reading his list, but let me officially tell you what it says. He's the professor of medicine at the UCLA Center for Public Health and Disasters. But David is sort of floats in and out of a lot of conversations around resilience and communities and what it takes to make communities resilient and using communities to do that. So that's a big build-up, David. So now you can deliver for us. David Eisenman, everyone.
Well, thank you, John. Good morning to everybody. It's great to see a lot of faces of friends and colleagues out here from across the country. It's always great to see New Yorkers who come out and care about California's biggest risk, earthquakes. So I'm going to speak to you about building coalitions to enhance resilience. And actually, let's see, I pressed the green button. I'm actually going to talk about building them out, not building them de novo. And I'm going to focus on our work, which is the Los Angeles County Community Disaster Resilience Project. So this is a project that was led by the County Department of Public Health, but had major partners in the universities UCLA and RAND, an academic institution, as well as Loma Linda, and then partnerships in the community, VOAD, in the Community Clinics Association, as well as a lot of funders, Office of Emergency Management here, and notably USGS, which is actually one of the first times we've seen this kind of partnership, and it's actually probably how John and I first met. The Los Angeles County Community Disaster Resilience Project, or LACCDR, and you can really, I encourage you to go to our website down there at the bottom to get a lot more than I can tell you today, a lot of our resources and our academic papers. The point of the project, it was a collaborative effort to promote community resilience in the face of public health emergencies and disasters. Now, this was public health leading it, but what I'm going to tell you about really could be done by offices of emergency management, community agencies, other government agencies. It really is just how public health decided to operationalize this. So I can give you a little bit of background that's important for your understanding. We started with a theory. There's nothing as important as a good theory when you're doing a program. I recommend them. Public health says that there are 8 levers. There's 8 things we can do to improve community resilience. And if you change these levers, you will improve community resilience. Well, of course, if we improve the baseline wellness of the community and their access to services, that'll help increase their baseline resilience. But in a project like this, we're going to focus on shorter-term levers like education, engagement, self-sufficiency, and partnership. The partnership part being, of course, fundamental to coalitions. So let me focus a little bit on those 4 levers and what I mean by them. So self-sufficiency refers to ensuring a sense of personal responsibility among neighbors and among individuals in the community. And of course, the neighbor-to-neighbor reliance that we know is going to happen, initiating that before a disaster. It's improving coping skills among the households as well as within the community. It's improving their ties to community organizations, and it's linking the civic organizations and the activities that they are doing with preparedness and recovery so it becomes a leveraged activity. Education refers to, of course, informing households about preparedness, which we've been doing for a long time, but also about their community resources. What do they already have in their community, both in the way of human resources and assets and resources that can be used in a disaster in planning, response, and recovery? And of course, community vulnerabilities, hazards as well as social vulnerabilities. And connecting the community's actions to improving wellness and as a baseline issue into improving resilience. Engagement refers to the idea of broad inclusivity, of tapping into and including all the various segments, as many as we can, of our communities. And we talk about access and functional need populations. We really focus on planning with, not for, access and functional need populations. And building social connectedness and social cohesion in the community is fundamental. The research is very important, is very, very clear on this. Finally, partnerships. We talk about building out partnerships, organizational networks between community organizations and faith-based organizations, between those community organizations and government agencies, between government agencies. Just the government agencies themselves crossing, and I'll give you some examples later on. So creating that organizational network that will turn out in the recovery phase. It will develop out of its own. Let's start to get that going in advance. So identifying the shared strategies and resources for response and recovery that they can do together, and integrating resilience into their routine activities. So what does this mean in operations? Well, we've been doing in traditional emergency preparedness sort of the same thing for a long time. We've focused on individual households and response readiness with a particular focus on the need for emergency supplies and plans, kits and plans, kits and plans. There's a huge space this leaves between preparedness and what people actually end up doing, which they then believe they're going to have to rely on the first responders. We want to fill that space. And we've done a lot of this kind of exhortations and campaigns focusing on catastrophic disasters. The community resilience approach is a little bit different. It starts with assessing and addressing the community's resources, as I mentioned, as well as its vulnerabilities, developing the community partnerships across diverse sectors, and in our project, we divided the community for heuristic purposes into 12 different sectors to help people see where they need to include more groups. We use community engagement for planning, preparedness, and response, and we look at community-level trainings and education, not household level. We talk about community preparedness networks and improving social connections. So the first step to getting prepared is saying hello to your neighbor, talking to your neighbor. And we actually address not just acute emergencies like a catastrophic earthquake, but also the slow burning ones, like in California, drought, or the changes that will be brought by climate change. So in the LACCDR project, this started in 2011 when we convened town halls, several of them across Los Angeles, to bring together stakeholders from healthcare, Office of Emergency Services, seniors centers, mental health, public works, parks and recreation, faith-based organizations, so on and so forth, media, business, to talk about resilience and what did it mean in California. And this is 2011. We still had no idea how to operationalize this very notional term. We broke into work groups. Those work groups dove down into what can we do to improve resilience. We developed some tools, and then by 2012, we decided we're ready to launch a program. We selected 16 communities across Los Angeles, and in late 2012, we rolled out the program. We did it for 2 years. We left the field in 2015. We're now in the data analysis evaluation, data analysis of our evaluation data phase, as well as looking to replicate this in other jurisdictions. So if you're interested in replications, see me afterwards. So we took 16 communities. They were diverse along hazards. Some of them, all of them, of course, had earthquake as a hazard. But they also, some of them were up in the urban wilderness wildland interface. So they had fires and mudslides, debris flows. Some of them had had major flooding in the past. Some of them had heat waves, the high desert. That was a big concern, as well as drought. So they had diversity of hazard exposures. They had a diversity of SES, but they all were, on purpose, this was a first-line experiment, smaller cities in Los Angeles, or smaller communities of around 30,000 people that had a mixture of commercial and residential and schools, so it really represented the community. And they all had to have a coalition already. We were not going to, out of de novo, create a coalition. We were going to build out a coalition. So as you can see from the slide, our coalitions, though, were very diverse. In Acton and Agua Dulce, which is our high desert, we had the town councils. In La Crescenta, we had their fire safety council. We had in Pico Union, which is a predominantly Spanish-speaking community, we had their neighborhood council, and Culver City, their neighborhood watch. We had a gang task force from Watts. The Zucchi Community Clinic in Wilmington. And let me step back. We had these 16 communities, and we randomly assigned them to getting either the community resilience experimental intervention or traditional preparedness intervention. I'll describe that in a moment. So I'm just showing you the communities now and describing the coalitions. Again, sort of the same spread in our preparedness communities, but I'll point now to number 7, which was a faith-based organization network, and number 8, which was a homeless coalition. So really, coalition could be anything. And as John said, it's really about the passion they brought. And they didn't actually start out with a passion for disasters. I mean, the gang task force, that was not their first order of business. But they had a passion for their community. And that's why they thought that they could, and they had a passion for the idea of resilience. And those two things, plus their, really gave them the emotional latch to this work. So on the resilience side, we randomized 8 to resilience, 8 to traditional preparedness. We had the coalitions already existing. Our job was going to be put public health facilitators into each coalition. And these facilitators were either health educators or nurses, but they really could be anybody from your organization who has community skills, who likes to be out in the community, not behind their desk. We trained those facilitators in community resilience, and we trained them in our toolkit elements. And then the facilitators trained the coalitions in community resilience and in the toolkit. And talking about community resilience is very difficult. It's changing people's thinking, and it's a hard thing to talk about. And so we really worked on that and revised that approach over the years. The coalitions then went out and recruited further members to develop further partnerships from what I talked about, the 12 sectors. The coalitions assessed their vulnerabilities and their resources, and we used mapping software to help with that, and much appreciated the help from the USGS on that. The coalitions then wrote, through a process of deliberation, a plan for improving their own community's resilience, and then they spent time implementing the activities to improve their resilience. Now, fundamentally, I'm a scientist, so I want to evaluate our work. And this is really an innovation. We need to see what are the results. As you know, we can't measure community resilience so easily in the community. But we can measure the changes in the levers I talked about. And if our theory is right, that if you improve those levers, you're improving resilience, we can measure these proximal outcomes. So we looked at organizational networks and whether that improved. And there's many markers of that. I'm not going to get too geeky on that. We looked at the skills within the coalitions in terms of engagement, education, and self-sufficiency, and we did that with tabletop exercises. And then we did a survey in the communities to look at household impact. And we didn't expect to see much household impact, frankly, given the short duration. But we looked at improvements in engagement, education, self-sufficiency, and the social networks at the household level. Our toolkit's online. I recommend you go there. This is a snapshot of the cover. It really focuses on 6 major areas. First of all, what is resilience and why it matters? We really have to, it's an educational process, getting people to think about that. Knowing your community. So who's in your community? What are your hazards? What are your vulnerabilities? What are your resources? Partnership. Who is not at the table that needs to be included? Now that you've seen your hazards and who is most at risk, if you've seen now that you have a large community that has, that's near a debris flow area, risk area, and there's no mental health service provider near them, maybe you need to reach out to the communities next door to you to bring mental health providers to the table next to you. This all can be mapped and assessed. Build your plan, and then your steps for action, and we also bake in some metrics for evaluation and feedback. And then sustainability of your coalition. The facilitator is very important. The coalition already exists, we're trying to build it out. So how it's facilitated is probably one of the most important parts of this. And I think it's worth talking for a moment about the differences in the facilitators and what they did. On the resilience side, they focused on helping the coalitions understand resilience and the tools and resources we were providing the coalitions. They led them through this collaborative process of assessing vulnerabilities and resources, identifying the missing sectors, and outreaching to those missing sectors and bringing them in. We provided technical support to the resilience coalitions, the university, DPH, Public Health Department, USGS. We acted as technical assistants, and when the coalitions had a question they wanted to figure out how to handle or some advice, the facilitator reached out to the technical assistance crew for that. On the other hand, the traditional preparedness arm, really the facilitators there just focused on traditional preparedness material, kits and plans. And anything else they wanted to do over time was demand-driven. If they wanted to talk about other topics, and then at that point resilience was in the air, so the words were starting to come in, they had to really ask for it. So what did our coalitions do? Really a range of things. Acton Agua Dulce, and this is some examples. Acton Agua Dulce had some ham radio operators that are up in the high desert, they know they're isolated. They built out their ham radio network, they trained new people, they created kind of a hub and spoke program for finding isolated elderly. Compton did disaster preparedness, traditional preparedness, but now in Section 8 housing. They built and then fielded on buses a sign language video on disaster preparedness. They did gun safety, and they did map your neighborhood workshops. Pico Union, which had never had any cert certified people in the community held so many trainings that they had dozens of CERT certified people by the end of 2 years. And then after they exhausted the adult CERT certification pool, they then did teen CERT. So this is just more of what they did. But we reached, over the course of 2 years, between the two arms, over 38,000 people through the strengths of these coalitions doing activities almost monthly. So just a little bit of data. This is preliminary. I just wanted to share with you today. We did look at organizational networks. I promised to talk about coalitions. The resilience arm, which is the red line there, increased its average number of organizations from 14.1 to 14.1, whereas the preparedness coalitions increased their number of coalitions of organizations to 8.4. This is statistically significant. It's a small sample size, I recognize, but not only was there an increase so the slope of line is greater, plus the absolute difference is greater. In our surveys of the community, the resilience communities pre-post, so at the baseline and then after we came out of the community, we saw improvements. More community members said that they had talked with neighbors about preparing for a disaster or emergency. And though it's only a 4% difference, that's pretty remarkable if you know anything about public health interventions and social science in a short period of time. We saw increases in the belief that planning with neighbors for disasters is important. That's really something we've never seen before. And recall for messages that reminding them that emergencies happen increased. So lastly, I'm going to leave you, I guess this gets back to the sort of the cycle of optimism versus the cycle of angst. In an article in The Atlantic, James Fallows writes about an article called How America is Putting Itself Back Together. And in the face of national conversations about dysfunction and inactivity at the federal level, he notes how we have small and medium-sized cities dotting the United States, 50 cities that he visited, that are undergoing, because of what he calls their cultural and economic resilience, and he uses these words, a cultural and economic renaissance. He actually does a really nice little, one of those little sidebars of the 11 ingredients that he sees very qualitatively are the key ingredients to their economic and cultural renaissance. And they really nicely align with the 4 levers that I described in resilience. So he talks about private-public partnerships. We're talking about organizational networks. He talks about leadership. We talk about self-sufficiency in education. He talks about the importance of connections to universities and innovative education at all levels. We talk about education. He talks about bringing in immigrant communities and newcomers into the community, into the economics of the community. We talk about engagement. So these are, I think, fundamental levers of whatever resilience you're really talking about and whatever renaissance you want to accomplish. And I think renaissance really is an output or an outcome of resilience. So I'd like us to, I use the laboratories of resilience, and here I am quoting myself, but I'd like to see us thinking about cities as being laboratories of resilience, not just laboratories of economic and cultural renaissance. Thank you very much.
So there's our pictures in case you forget what we look like, right there. So before I get into questions, I got a text during this conversation from one of you in the audience saying, you didn't really introduce yourself, John. So I just wanted to take a moment. So my name's John Boeri, as you can see by the picture. I spent 11 years working for the city of Los Angeles for the mayor and 3 city council members, and then 3 years working for the USGS with Dr. Jones and others at the Pasadena office and in the Natural Hazards Mission Area for the USGS, looking at partnerships and coalitions and that kind of work. But I came to the scene, and the reason I've found myself in many of these meetings every 4 years is the experience that we had with a coalition back in 2007. And so I know that some of you may have heard of this thing called Shakeout. Anybody heard of Shakeout? I know this group, you talk about it a lot. And if you look at who created Shakeout, you can't point to one person, and no matter who claims to have created it as an individual, it was a group of people from very diverse backgrounds, and I was honored to be invited to be a part of that group of people that was able to say we can do things differently if we look at it from different perspectives and respect each other's perspectives. And so that experience there led to now it's almost a decade worth of work in earthquakes and hazards as it relates to coalition building and bringing unlikely partners to the table to advance the safety initiatives that are a priority to many people in this room, for instance. And so, by way of example, the other projects that I've worked on as well include, most recently, the LA City retrofit ordinance. Some of you may have heard of, if you were here, I think it was yesterday, when they had the panel led by a colleague, Marissa Aho, was yesterday, right? On San Francisco and LA and ordinances and resilience by design. It didn't happen by chance that it happened, and it didn't happen in LA. It happened by sort of plotting and planning, and it basically started actually before I even got involved, probably early 2000s, when USGS scientists started to talk to emergency managers about their needs. That led to a meeting in the office of Mayor Garcetti in 2013, just after our friend, I think, Ron, are you back in the room? Ron Lynn, are you in there? There's Ron Lynn, LA Times. You know, Ron is to blame for the retrofit ordinance. So if you're a pissed building owner, and I know you're not here because nobody said they owned a building, if you're mad that you have to do retrofit, it's Ron's fault. It's Ron's fault because he wouldn't let up. He continued to pursue information, and I can't see him, so he might be blushing. But it was him and his colleagues. I mean, he works with a great team of people at the LA Times and in representing his industry of the media. But he continued to ask questions of many parts of the community. And, you know, he could probably do a better job of explaining what the media's role is. But from my perspective, and probably many of you share it, those of you who work with media and media relations, they're looking for all angles of a story. And so when they go to, if the city council all of a sudden passes an ordinance unanimously that's going to require retrofit, his job is to go and talk to those directly impacted and get their opposition to that, right? Or to go to the association of lobbyists that work to make sure that they protect, you know, low costs for building owners and get their comment of opposition. And Ron, correct me if I'm wrong and tell me if I'm wrong, but when he went to those that would be negatively, quote, negatively impacted, or those that would be bear some burden of financial cost or work, there wasn't an argument that says we shouldn't be doing this. There was a little bit of a disagreement about how exactly you finance it. They knew they'd have to be on the hook for something, but they didn't say, how dare the city council do this. There were no lawsuits filed, and there's probably a lot that could have been filed. There was no appeals made in a formal way. And it's because Ron's work initially to educate people, so education is key, we heard about that, but it's also because those involved at the city and Dr. Jones, who you heard from yesterday, and some people behind the scenes, worked to make sure that other people were engaged in the conversation, because the official process is the city does their work. Remember, there was like 7 of you from local government. Raise your hand again so I make sure I don't offend you. Okay, a couple of folks over here. So you know, the official process is the city does their work and then presents it publicly at a city council meeting. The unofficial process is that you work with all the stakeholders behind the scenes in advance to make sure that they're involved in the process and they feel ownership of the outcome so that you don't have opposition. That's how good policy is made. And that's what happened. It was building a coalition of apartment owners, building owners, and some saying, hey, you know, we don't have an issue with it, just tell us what you mandate everyone to do, don't pick on us specifically. You know, nuances like that came out of the conversation. And it was through that kind of coalition building that you see sweeping retrofit ordinance in Los Angeles that 2007 when it was, or actually I think 2005 it was pushed first and met tremendous opposition from the business community. 2007 it was brought up again, tremendous opposition. And so it was a progression. It took time to build understanding and awareness, but it was also about bringing people to the table and having them join in the effort of solution rather than telling them what they had to do. And that's a really good example of how a coalition can be built somewhat ad hoc and somewhat unofficially. Some other tactics that are used, and then I'll go right to questions, sorry guys. Some other tactics that we heard about was listening and telling, but also having a clear outcome of where you want to go. So if you want to form a coalition, you don't want to just say, we need to get together and do something about earthquakes. That's not going to get you very far until you take a very clear approach of where you want to go, and then also look for small wins that are short-term as leading to your final goal in order to allow people to feel successful with you, and that understanding that coalition creates a partnership together that is successful. You also want to make sure that you, as a leader, if you're going to lead a coalition, you pull more than your weight, because there needs to be a driver, a leader. And whether it's you or someone else, someone's got to move it forward, because it's easy just to say, well, someone else will do it. You've got to lead by example. And you really have to find what you can agree upon and move forward on that, and don't try to agree on everything. Because no matter who you are, how good you are at bringing people together, you're not all going to agree on everything. And so you've got to find what you can agree on and move forward together on that item. And then finally, discover solutions together. Don't tell people the answer, but work together to develop the solution so that you can celebrate that success as a group, that you're all part of it. Because I don't know if anybody here, and I challenge you to raise your hand, if you single-handedly have been responsible for any change in the world. There's no one that is single-handedly responsible. And if you are, I'd love to talk with you afterward and what your secret is. But even if you drive something forward for a long time, there's always someone else involved. And so you have to be able to know that it does take groups to get things done together. So with that, I wrote some questions as our speakers were talking, but I'd like to first start with a more generic question. Excuse me. How do you define community? And both of you, what is your definition of community? And that'll lead into our conversation of coalitions. So that's for both of you.
Yeah, well, that's a question we've avoided because everyone has a different definition. And I think it's okay to have a different definition as long as you have a clear definition. So it depends on what unit you're trying to operate on. Clearly, we have spatial communities, and that's the definition we used. And we tried to make it an operational definition in Los Angeles, as I said, where we had smaller communities that had a sense of place. And that often was including a market area, schools, residential, all mixed. You know, Los Angeles has areas where that just doesn't occur, but we also know, those of us who are Angelinos, that we have fantastic neighborhoods. And so tapping into that neighborhood that we have in Los Angeles was what we just defined as community. You could have a community that you defined as the people who are all together on Facebook. I mean, that's certainly a community too. So it really depends on where you're trying to make change.
Yeah, I was I was avoiding that one as well.
That's why I asked it.
I mean, to me, it's not as important as how you define the community, because obviously there can be digital communities, there can be spatial communities, there can be stakeholder communities. What's more important is that you bring them all together and have one environment where you're getting everybody's needs on the table for mitigation.
So going back to Charlie first, what do you think coalitions need to know before they get started? So we talked a lot about information and access to information. So what would you say, and we're talking earthquakes here, what do you think that they need to know if you're trying to form a coalition or expand a coalition around earthquakes, earthquake safety, let's assume, and not more earthquakes? What do you think they need to know? What's some basic things they need to know to start?
Well, I think they need to know that there's hope and that there's things that they can do. First and foremost, and they need to know what their risk is. That's from my perspective. You know, they need to understand what to expect in different types of events, and they need to understand what they can do to survive those events and what they can do to affect political change.
Nice. That's very succinct. So then, David, do you think that there's a difference between a coalition and a community?
Oh, absolutely. Coalitions in our communities may or may not have fully represented the communities before we got there, and may or may not have fully represented them even after we left. You know, coalitions, first of all, tend to attract leaders. And they also tend to attract in communities, at least the coalitions that are most easily found, the main segment of the community, so that actually lots of these sort of hidden populations in the community have a high probability of not being represented in these coalitions. And it was interesting to see when we worked with communities that I knew very well, such as Culver City, because my kids go to school there, as they started to map out their neighborhood using census data, they discovered whole census tract of language speakers, non-primary English speaking language speakers that they didn't know about. And they certainly weren't part of their original coalition.
So, Charlie, question. You talked about the spiral of optimism. How can it be set in motion? So it's a process, I understand that, but how can we sort of inspire a spiral of optimism?
Well, again, that's my thesis is that you can tell people what you know and listen to what they have to say. So, I can only answer from a risk perspective. My background, is technology. The way that I know, obviously the media plays a very important role in giving people information about what's likely to happen and what they can do, and helps build the political will to affect change. But my theory is that the more that you give them information about what you know, and the more that you listen to them in these coalitions, and the more you're able to impact change.
May I answer that
Sure,
also?
sure.
I think that was really fundamental to the coalition's success in our experience. You're right. The literature really clearly shows that fear messages don't work. In our messaging about preparedness, that's been very clearly demonstrated. What does work is giving people a sense of efficacy, that they can do something about this, about whatever the problem is, and that it will work. And actually the story of resilience, the resilient stories that one can tell, are very optimistic and show this at the very local level. I have a set of slides that I took after I went to Hurricane Sandy. After Hurricane Sandy passed, I went to New York to show pictures of people riding a bicycle, creating a sort of a generator on the street so that everybody could plug in their telephones. And signs up were saying free healthcare, and signs saying free burritos, and showing pictures from Airbnb where people were putting their homes up for free. And the only reason it says $10 is because you have to put a number in that box. And this was all resilience. This was all people coming out and helping each other. And when you bring that message out, start with that. And then also, by the way, dispel the myths around looting in America, and really start to really get into some of the, really address some of the media myths that they worry about. You give them a sense that they already have the power to do something. They're going to do it anyway, naturally. That's the herd instinct in human beings, is to help each other out. So let's just plan to make it even better.
And I think you're bringing up a good point, and that's that it comes down to people, fundamentally. So coalitions, a lot of times we talk about organizations. I know David listed a number of organizations, but when he talked about the leaders, it's really about individuals representing an organization, because you actually don't have, individuals don't have relationships with organizations unless they're a member of them, and that therefore indicative of the fact that it is a person and not an organization. So when it comes to people, that's what the fundamental here is in building coalitions. It's connecting to them as human beings. And that free burrito is about helping people because a human being is hungry. And food is a great way to start a coalition. Free pizza, people come up to your meeting. And then you say, and by the way, we're going to change the world through earthquake preparedness and safety. We have about 10 minutes left. So I do want to offer opportunity for the audience to offer a question. But first, Charlie has something he'd like to say.
I think free burritos are nice. I like free burritos. But I think that it's important to really recognize the role of insurance in this process. I mean, it's there's kind of a short-term resilience, but the change between a disaster and a major catastrophe with cascading impacts, as Craig was talking about earlier, is really whether or not businesses can get back on their feet and people can have jobs and there's water and then all these other things. And I think that having insurance in place to get money into people's hands as soon as possible so that they can start to rebuild their lives is quite important. So I think it needs to somehow be brought into the resilience conversation because it's a big factor.
Anybody part of an insurance coalition? Anybody a member of an insurance coalition that deals with risk reduction in earthquakes? So find those people. Raise your hands again. Those are the people that are going to, 4 years from now, they're going to have a panel on the coalition for insurance around earthquakes and how they've changed things. You have 4 years. You can do it, right? Okay. Doable. Perfect. Time horizons. So who's got questions for our panelists? Do we have a mic, or are we just yelling them out? Oh, we have a mic. Here it comes. Here it comes. And a question, by the way, ends with a question mark, not just your voice going up. I mean, you don't make a statement and say, huh? We're looking for questions for the panel,
Okay.
and not statements.
Charlie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but what did you tell the doorman?
What did I tell the doorman? I said, no, you're not. First, I had a hard time understanding what he said exactly, and I said, no, you're not. This is not going to become an island. It's an over-exaggeration, and that actually rung true for him. I had to book it out. I have to probably give him a better answer than that, but he seemed to accept that. I think that's really important to communicate to people.
Lori.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. I think it's been a really useful session. I have a question that relates to a comment you just made, David, about information being, the data that social scientists have collected shows that we can't scare people. And in talking about coalitions, some of the work you're specifically talking about are the general public and communities and people who don't have positions of responsibility such as us. And I want to compare and contrast that with a statement that Craig Fugate made, which was that we need to plan for not what we already know, but what we don't know or what we expect could be possible, so the extreme event. And I think we have seen really good success in LA, in San Francisco, in other places, really delving into scenarios like the shakeout scenario, the work we've done with the Resilient City and CAPS in San Francisco, explaining what the improbable or unexpected or more extreme than people remembered with Loma Prieta or Northridge, in really being able to move forward the earthquake safety programs, adoption of retrofits, et cetera. And so technical coalitions, in my opinion, need to actually not necessarily be scared, but be motivated and be explained, better understand these things that I think we often feel we can't necessarily or are afraid to talk about. But I also do recognize and appreciate this comment of not scaring the public or scaring people who don't have the resources or the ability to act. So I wondered how you see that in a spectrum and where we could better position our thinking on that, because I think that it's not just one or the other. So that's my question.
Yes, okay, so on the scare side, where it's just pure scare, it's the picture on the billboards that our governments and our Office of Emergency Management place that shows a destroyed house and says, "Are you prepared?" That's the scare side. That doesn't work. But I agree with you that answering people's fears with fact is very important, and giving them even a little more sense of why what they're doing is urgent is important, and that will, that's not the same as fear mongering. But for instance, telling people in Los Angeles, yes, you're going to have no water for a few weeks. And the recommendation that you need 1 week of water just doesn't fly in Los Angeles, if you've read Lucy's report.
Yes.
So I think that's not fear-mongering, that's being realistic. I hope that answers your question, but that's really, bringing them, telling them, reducing the concern in Playa del Rey that, which is one of our communities on the beach, that a tsunami is going to swallow them up, and that the first thing they need to buy is a boat to put on their roof. And I swear to you, I've heard this a half dozen times. Let me put an inflatable on my roof in Playa del Rey. What you should really worry about is the fact that you're on this kind of liquefiable land and so on, and to talk about that, to direct their attentions to the right things. Yes.
I want to close by thanking our panelists and offering their insights. Their approaches to supporting and building coalitions are just two examples of, I know many in this room even, of coalition building, but if you could give them a round of applause, please. And then I'd like to have you all take one last action, two actions. First, how many of you feel like you're a member of a coalition? Okay, half. How many of you think that you could have more people in your coalition? Okay. How many of you are not in a coalition and want to be in a coalition? No one wants to be in the coalition for earthquake safety. So here's what I would ask that you do as we work towards transition and Kate comes up and gives us our direction for our next panel. Think for just a minute who the ideal person to enhance the coalition that you're a part of currently is. Think about who that person is if you're in a coalition currently. If you're not in a coalition, think about the ideal coalition that you'd actually want to spend time working on. And then there's two things you could do. Either tackle me in the hallway, or you can email me at john, @stratoscope.com, which is my company and my email, and I'll agree to email you back and either make the connection to the person that you want in your coalition, in your community, or connect you with someone in this room that knows someone in for that coalition, or connect you to a coalition that you could be a part of that would be useful for your time and your expertise. Because even if we just made each of us made one extra connection to a coalition from this room today, it would exponentially support the work we're trying to accomplish as a group as we move forward in building a national strategy to increase earthquake safety. So thank you so much. I look forward to talking and working with all of you.